Valentine's Eve in Seoul wasn't a celebration, it was a sentence. Park Jin-wook stood motionless in his Gangnam penthouse, the skyline of the city blurring into neon streaks behind the rain-pelted glass. The room was a graveyard of red, thousands of roses imported from the coast, left in their crates, their scent thick and cloying. They weren't for a celebration, they were for a ghost. Jin-wook had buried his heart 3 years ago in a shallow grave of grief and cold steel. He lived in the silence of his own making. Then the glass shifted. In the dark reflection of the window, he saw a miracle. The same defiant tilt of the head, the same crown of hair that used to slip through his fingers, the same eyes that had been closed forever. His pulse, dead for 3 years, thundered once. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply leaned into the shadows of his men and whispered, "Bring her to me." Before we begin, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. Valentine's Eve smelled like expensive gin and desperation. Talia Nairi Lawson adjusted the heavy lens of her camera, the off-shoulder strap of her red silk dress digging into her skin. She wasn't here for the champagne or the elite company. She was here because the landlord didn't accept artistic potential as currency. The gala was a sea of false smiles and crystal chandeliers that hung like jagged ice from the ceiling. Talia kept her head down, focusing on her shutter speed. That was how you survived a room full of predators. You became invisible. Then the room changed. It didn't get louder, it went cold. The laughter stopped mid-breath. The musicians faltered. Security teams in sharp black suits snapped to attention with the precision of a firing squad. Talia felt the weight of a gaze before she saw the man. Park Jin-wook stood at the edge of the balcony, a king looking over a kingdom he was ready to burn. She made the mistake of looking up. Their eyes locked and the air left the room. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled Seoul forgot how to speak. And Talia realized that tonight she wasn't just the photographer, she was the prize. The golden light of the hotel ballroom felt more like a spotlight than an invitation. Talia Nairi Lawson shifted the weight of her camera bag, feeling the silk of her red off-shoulder dress rustle against her skin. It was a beautiful dress, a thrifted treasure she'd saved for a night like this. But standing amidst the elite of Seoul, she felt the familiar, sharp edges of being an outsider. Her natural afro, coiled in a tight, crown-like halo, drew glances that ranged from curiosity to cold indifference. She didn't mind. She was here for the shots, not the small talk. She moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a shadow, capturing the glittering jewelry and the forced laughter of men who owned half the skyline. Each click of the shutter was a step closer to making rent. That was her reality, survival dressed in satin. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hundreds of red roses that lined the walls. It was a romantic's dream, but to her, it smelled like a heavy, suffocating kind of wealth. Talia paused near a towering marble pillar to check her exposure settings. For a moment, she allowed herself to look up, her gaze wandering toward the VIP balconies that overlooked the floor. That's when the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She felt it before she saw him, a sudden, electric prickle at the base of her neck. It was the sensation of being watched, not by a casual passerby, but by something focused and predatory. She turned her head slowly, her eyes climbing the shadows of the mezzanine until they landed on a figure standing by the rail. He was tall, his athletic build cutting a sharp silhouette against the neon-blurred windows behind him. He wasn't wearing a full suit, just a black vest over a white shirt, a look that felt dangerously casual in this sea of tuxedos. Even from this distance, the dark ink of tattoos crawling up his neck were visible, marking him as a man who lived by his own laws. But it was his face that stopped her heart. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at her. His gaze wasn't the wandering eye of a flirt or the arrogant stare of a billionaire. It was haunted. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost or a miracle he wasn't prepared for. Talia's fingers froze on her camera. She should have looked away. That was the unspoken rule of surviving rooms filled with men like him. But she found herself trapped in the intensity of his stare. In that moment, the music, the clinking glasses, and the murmurs of the elite faded into a dull hum. She saw his lips move, a soft whisper lost to the distance, directed at the wall of black-suited men standing behind him. One of the men nodded, his eyes immediately dropping to Talia. Panic, cold and sudden, flared in her chest. She had spent years learning how to exist in spaces that weren't made for her by being invisible, but the man on the balcony had just stripped that invisibility away. She gripped her camera tight, her pulse thudding against her ribs. She needed to leave. She needed to fade back into the city rain before the gravity of his gaze pulled her under. But as she turned to retreat toward the exit, she saw three men in dark suits detach themselves from the shadows of the bar, their eyes locked onto her crown of curls with military precision. The hunt had begun, and the ballroom was no longer a party. It was a cage. The heavy glass doors of the ballroom felt miles away. Talia moved with an urgency she tried to mask as professional haste, her camera bag bumping rhythmically against her hip. She didn't look back at the balcony. She didn't need to. The phantom heat of Park Jin-wook's gaze was still searing the skin between her shoulder blades. The air in the hallway was cooler, smelling of floor wax and rain, but the relief was short-lived. The three men she had seen earlier weren't following her. They were intercepting her. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, cutting off the angles of the corridor until she was forced to a halt near a decorative alcove. "Miss Lawson," the man in the center said. His voice was like a low-frequency hum devoid of any inflection. He didn't ask her name, he stated it. "Our chairman would like a word." Talia pulled her camera bag tighter, her knuckles turning white against the leather strap. "I'm finished for the night. If the chairman wants the proofs, my agency will send them over on Monday." She tried to step around them, but the man on the right shifted, a wall of broad shoulders and expensive wool blocking her path. He didn't touch her, but the threat was implicit. These were not the kind of men who accepted a polite refusal. They were the kind of men who removed obstacles. "It isn't about the photographs," the lead man said, stepping closer. The light of the hallway caught the edge of a silver pin on his lapel, the insignia of the Valent Syndicate's sole branch. "It is a private matter. He is waiting in the motor pool." "I'm not going anywhere," Talia said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain firm. "Move, or I'll start screaming, and I guarantee your chairman doesn't want that kind of press at a charity gala." The lead man's expression didn't flicker. He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping second, Talia thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He pressed a button and held it toward her. "Talia," a voice whispered from the speaker. It wasn't the man in front of her. It was the man from the balcony. The voice was deep, gravelly, and carried a weight of sorrow that felt like a physical pressure. "Please, I have waited 3 years to see that face. Do not make my men be unkind. Just 10 minutes, that is all I ask." The intimacy of the plea was more terrifying than a threat. He spoke as if he knew her, as if they shared a secret history that she had somehow forgotten. Before she could find her breath to argue, the man in front of her gave a subtle nod. "This way, Miss Lawson," he said, his tone shifting from a request to a command. They flanked her, one in front and two behind, forming a human cage of black suits around her red dress. As they led her toward the service elevator, Talia looked at her reflection in the polished gold of the elevator doors. Her afro was still perfectly coiled, her dress still shimmered like a ruby, but her eyes looked back at her with the wide, wild stare of someone who had just stepped off a cliff. The doors slid shut with a silent, final hiss, and as the car began its descent into the bowels of the hotel, she realized that the 10 minutes he promised was a lie. Park Jin-wook hadn't sent for a guest. He had sent for a ghost he intended to keep. The ride up to the penthouse was a blur of silent, rising numbers on a digital display. When the elevator doors finally whispered open, Talia was met not with a room but with an atmosphere. The air here was thinner, colder, and heavy with the scent of rain and white lilies. The space was vast, a glass-walled sanctuary perched high above the neon arteries of Seoul. It was minimally furnished, low-slung leather chairs, polished stone floors, and a darkness that seemed to swallow the light of the city. In the center of the room stood Park Jin-wook. He was silhouetted against a massive window, a single glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't turn around immediately, but Talia felt the sudden shift in the room's energy the moment she stepped onto the marble floor. "Leave us," he said. The voice was the same one she'd heard through the phone, but in the open air, it carried a vibration that resonated in her chest. His men bowed with synchronized precision and retreated into the elevator, the doors closing with a finality that made Talia's breath hitch. Jinwook turned, slowly. Talia had prepared herself for a monster, or at least a man who would look at her with the cold calculation of a king inspecting new property. What she wasn't prepared for was the look of absolute, soul-shattering devastation that crossed his features. The glass in his hand tilted precariously as his eyes raked over her, from the crown of her afro to the shimmering red satin of her dress. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory, yet there was a tremor in his hands that betrayed a profound shock. As he stepped into the soft glow of a nearby floor lamp, the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe like living shadows. Talia took a step back, her heel clicking sharply against the stone. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "And why do you look at me like you've seen a ghost?" Jinwook stopped only a few feet away. He was taller than he'd appeared from the balcony, a mountain of controlled violence and suppressed grief. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from her face, as if he were trying to touch the air she breathed. "Her name was Hana," he said, his voice a low, broken rasp. "She had your stillness, your dignity, and when she turned to look at the rain, she moved exactly as you do." He finally let his hand drop, his gaze locking onto hers with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl even as it ignited a strange, terrifying heat. "I spent 3 years convinced the world had gone gray because she was no longer in it. I spent tonight preparing to say goodbye to her memory. And then I saw you." "I am not her," Talia said, her voice growing stronger with a surge of indignation. "I don't know who you lost, but I am Talia Lawson. I am a photographer. I am a person, not a memory you can just summon because you're lonely." Jinwook stepped even closer, bridging the final gap until she could smell the whiskey and the cold rain on his skin. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a spark of recognition that didn't exist. "You are a miracle," he whispered, the intensity of his obsession settling over her like a heavy velvet shroud. "And in this city, miracles are kept, they are protected, they are owned." The word owned hung in the frigid air of the penthouse like a physical weight. Talia felt a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline. She didn't look away from Jinwook. Instead, she tilted her chin up, her afro framing a face that was now set in a mask of defiance. "I am not a piece of art you can hang in your gallery, Mr. Park. You can't own a person." Jinwook didn't blink. The grief that had softened his features moments ago was being systematically replaced by the cold, calculating steel of the man who ruled the soul underworld. He walked to a desk made of dark, obsidian-like wood and picked up a slender file. He didn't look at it. He knew exactly what was inside. "Talia Nari Lawson," he said, the syllables of her name sounding strange and heavy in his accent. 3 months behind on rent, a student loan debt that is currently in collections, and a dream of a photography studio in the arts district that is currently nothing more than a folder of saved bookmarks on a laptop you can barely afford to keep charged. Talia felt a hot flush of shame. It was one thing to be poor. It was another to have your poverty read back to you like a list of sins by a man who wore a watch worth more than her childhood home. "You've been busy," she snapped. "I am a businessman," Jinwook replied, his voice regaining its rhythmic, commanding edge. He set the file down and leaned against the desk, crossing his tattooed arms. "And I am making you an offer. I do not want your body, Talia. I do not want your soul. I want your presence." He gestured to the vast, empty penthouse. "This city sees me as a man who has lost his edge because I spend my nights mourning a ghost. My rivals smell blood. I need the world to see that Park Jinwook has found something worth protecting again. I need them to see that face at my side." Talia narrowed her eyes. You want me to be a decoy, a prop. I want you to be a queen, he corrected, his gaze dropping to the red silk of her dress. In exchange, your debts vanish tonight. Your studio will be leased, fully equipped and funded for 5 years. You will never have to take a job at a gala for rent money again. You will have the life your talent deserves. The silence that followed was thick with the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. It was the devil's bargain, wrapped in the promise of freedom. Talia looked at the man before her, haunted, dangerous, and impossibly powerful. He was offering her everything she had ever worked for, but the price was her invisibility. She would be stepping out of the shadows and directly into the crosshairs of his world. "And if I say no?" she asked. Jinwook stood up straight, the shadows of the room seeming to lengthen behind him. "Then my men will drive you home. You will struggle. You will eventually lose that camera, and I will continue to watch you from the darkness, wondering why a miracle chose to wither when it could have bloomed." He reached out not to touch her but to slide a gold-plated pen across the desk toward her. "The contract is simple, Talia. Stay by my side until the city believes the lie. After that, you are free. Do we have an agreement?" Talia looked at the pen, then at the man who looked at her like she was the only light left in a dark world. She reached out, her fingers trembling only slightly as she gripped the cold metal. "10 minutes was a lie," she whispered. "In my world," Jinwook replied, his voice dropping to a possessive growl, "forever starts with a single second." The golden pen felt like a branding iron against Talia's fingers as she finalized the signature that tethered her life to Park Jin-wook. The ink had barely dried before the reality of her new life began to settle in, thick and suffocating like the scent of the lilies filling the room. Jin-wook didn't move. He stayed anchored to the edge of the obsidian desk, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw with a hunger that made her skin prickle. "Hana would have signed it with more hesitation," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. "She was always more fragile, more like the glass." Talia froze. The name hit her like a physical blow. She set the pen down with a sharp click that echoed off the marble walls. "My name is Talia," she said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart, "and I am not made of glass." Jin-wook didn't seem to hear her. He stood and walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, the predatory grace of a man who had forgotten how to exist without a target. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a stray coil of her afro. His touch was cold, yet it burned. "The way you hold your head," he whispered, his dark eyes clouded with a grief so deep it looked like madness. "It's as if she never left, as if the rain finally brought her back to me." Talia stepped back, batting his hand away. The pity she had felt for his mourning curdled into a sharp, bitter indignation. "Stop it," she snapped. "Look at me. Really look at me, Jin-wook. I am a black woman from a different world. I am a photographer. I have a life, a history, and a name that isn't hers. I am not a canvas for you to paint your dead girlfriend on." The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted instantly. The vulnerability in Jin-wook's gaze vanished, replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness. The tattooed dragon on his neck seemed to flex as his jaw tightened. He stepped into her personal space, his height looming over her like a thundercloud. "You signed the contract," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive growl. "You accepted the debt. In the eyes of this city and in this house, you are whatever I need you to be." "Then you bought the wrong woman," Talia shot back, her afro framing her face like a crown of defiance. She refused to shrink beneath his shadow. "You can pay my rent and buy my lenses, but you don't get to overwrite my soul. If you want a ghost, go to the cemetery. If you want me at your side, you will use my name." For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic lashing of the rain against the glass. Jin-wook stared at her, his expression unreadable, a battle raging behind his eyes between the man who mourned and the boss who commanded. He had expected a grateful survivor. He had found a fire he hadn't prepared to contain. "Hana never raised her voice," he said quietly, a strange, dark fascination flickering in his eyes. "Then get used to the noise," Talia replied, turning her back on him to look out at the city she had just sold her freedom to. "Because I'm going to be the loudest mistake you've ever made." The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by words, but by the sudden, rhythmic vibration of a phone on the obsidian desk. Jinwook didn't look away from Talia immediately. He lingered on her defiance, a ghost of a frown pulling at his scarred features. When he finally answered, his voice shifted into a dialect of Korean that sounded like serrated steel. The transition was instantaneous. The mourning lover vanished, replaced by the apex predator. "Stay here," he commanded, not looking back as he grabbed a heavy wool overcoat. "I'm not a dog you can tell to stay," Talia countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. If she was going to be trapped in this world, she refused to be blind to it. Before he could object, she grabbed her camera bag and followed him into the private elevator. The car descended into the bowels of the city, surfacing in a restricted loading dock in Incheon. The air here didn't smell like lilies or expensive whiskey. It smelled of salt, diesel, and wet concrete. Rain lashed against the black sedans waiting for them, and for the first time, Talia saw the true scale of the shadow Jinwook cast over Seoul. Dozens of men in identical black suits stood in the downpour, their heads bowed in synchronized reverence as Jinwook stepped out. He didn't lead her to a ballroom. He led her to a rusted warehouse where the light of the moon was filtered through grime-streaked skylights. Inside, a man was tied to a chair, his face a map of bruises. The atmosphere was thick with a cold, clinical violence. Talia's breath hitched, her fingers instinctively clutching the strap of her camera. She had seen poverty and struggle, but she had never seen the raw, unadulterated power of a man who decided who lived and who died. Jinwook didn't shout. He walked up to the man with a terrifying calmness, pulling a pair of leather gloves tight over his knuckles. "You were seen at the gala," Jinwook said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "You were looking for the miracle I found. You thought she was a weakness." The man in the chair spat blood, a desperate, gargled laugh escaping him. "She looks just like the dead one, Jinwook. The whole city knows you've gone soft for a ghost." The movement was so fast Talia almost missed it. Jinwook's fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He struck again, a methodical, rhythmic brutality that made Talia feel like the room was spinning. This was the man she had signed her life away to, not a grieving soul, but a monster who maintained his throne with blood. Jinwook stopped, his chest barely heaving, and turned to look at Talia. He stood over the broken man, the light catching the blood on his gloves. He looked at her not with the eyes of a lover, but with the eyes of a warning. "This is the heart of Seoul," he said, his voice dropping to that possessive, gravelly tone. "It is cold, it is violent, and now that you wear my mark, they will come for you to get to me." Talia looked at the man on the floor, then at the blood on Jinwook's hands. The red of the gala dress now felt like a target rather than a garment. She raised her camera, the shutter clicking in the hollow warehouse. The flash illuminated the violence for a split second. "Then you better make sure your mark is worth the price," she said, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. She had seen the monster now, and the terror was real, but so was the realization that in this cold heart of the city, she was the only thing that made him human. The drive back from Incheon was a heavy, suffocating silence. The neon lights of Seoul smeared against the car windows like wet paint, but inside the leather-bound sanctuary of the SUV, the air was thick with the metallic tang of the warehouse. Jinwook sat in the shadows of the backseat, his gloved hands resting on his knees, his profile as rigid as a statue. It wasn't until they were back in the penthouse, the doors clicking shut against the world, that the tension finally broke. Jinwook shed his overcoat, his movements weary. He moved toward the sideboard to pour a drink, but his hands, usually so steady, fumbled with the crystal decanter. Talia watched him from the center of the room. She was still wearing the red silk dress, now stained at the hem with the grime of the docks, but she didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like an observer of a collapsing star. "You're hurt," she said softly. He didn't turn. "It's nothing. Blood that isn't mine." "Your hand," she insisted, stepping closer. He finally looked down. His right hand was trembling, the leather of his glove split across the knuckles. With a frustrated huff, he ripped the gloves off and tossed them onto the table. His skin was raw, split, and swelling. Talia didn't wait for an invitation. She walked to the kitchen, returned with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, and sat on the edge of the leather sofa. "Sit," she commanded. For a second the Mafia boss flared in his eyes, the urge to refuse, to remain untouchable. But the weight of the night seemed to pull at his shoulders. He sank into the chair opposite her. Talia reached out and took his hand. His skin was burning hot against her cool touch, his palm large enough to swallow both of hers. Up close, the tattoos on his wrist were intricate, thorns and ink that disappeared beneath his cuff. As she began to dab at the bruised skin, Jin-wook's breath hitched. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers instinctively curled around hers, not in a display of strength, but in a desperate, grounding grip. The tattooed grip that usually signaled a death sentence felt, in this moment, like a plea for anchor. "Hana used to hate the violence," he whispered, his voice cracking, the icy facade finally showing a hairline fracture. "She would cry if I came home like this. She wanted me to be a different man, a man who didn't exist." Talia looked up, her gaze steady. "I'm not crying, Jin-wook. I'm cleaning the wound. There's a difference." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time the ghost of Hana wasn't between them. He saw the fire in Talia's eyes, the strength in her hands, and the crown of her afro backlit by the city lights. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a slow, reverent movement. "You aren't made of glass," he admitted, his voice a ghost of a sound. "You're made of something much more dangerous." He leaned forward, his forehead almost touching hers, the scent of whiskey and lilies swirling between them. For one heartbeat, the predator was gone, leaving only a man who had been alone in the dark for too long. He didn't let go of her hand. He held it as if it were the only thing keeping him from drifting back into the gray. In the silence of the penthouse, the contract felt less like a cage and more like a bridge. And as Talia looked into his haunted eyes, she realized the monster was beginning to bleed. The transition from the sanctuary of the penthouse to the industrial grid of Incheon was jarring. Talia sat in the back of the armored sedan, her camera bag resting on her lap like a shield. She had swapped the red silk for a structured black blazer and slim trousers, but her afro remained her crown, unyielding and bold. Beside her, Jin-wook was a study in lethal composure. He had bandaged his hand, the white gauze stark against his black sleeve, but his eyes were fixed on the shipping containers that lined the pier like giant, rusted coffins. This was a business meeting, but in Jin-wook's world, business was a polite word for a standoff. He needed to show the rival Gwang-ho clan that he was back, and he needed them to see the miracle at his side to prove he was no longer a man paralyzed by the past. The meeting took place in a glass-walled office overlooking the shipyard. The air was thick with the smell of salt and cheap cigarettes. As they entered, the chatter of the rival gang died instantly. Every eye moved to Talia. She felt the weight of their judgment, the confusion at her skin, the shock at her hair, and finally, the slow, dangerous realization of the resemblance she carried. She didn't look down. She raised her camera and began to work, the rhythmic click of the shutter punctuating the tense silence. "You brought a toy to a negotiation park," the Gwang-ho leader sneered, leaning back in his chair. He was a man with skin like parchment and eyes that held no light. "Or is she the ghost come back to tell us you've lost your mind?" Jin-wook's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "She is the only reason this city is still standing today," he replied, his voice a low, vibrating warning. "Because she reminded me that I have things left to burn." Talia moved to the edge of the room to get a wider angle, but as she adjusted her lens, she saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass. One of the Gwang-ho soldiers wasn't looking at Jin-wook. He was reaching into the small of his back, his eyes locked on her with a singular, murderous intent. "Jin-wook," she cried out, her voice cutting through the posturing. The room exploded. The soldier drew a serrated blade, lunging toward Talia before Jin-wook's men could react. The chair Jin-wook was sitting in hit the floor as he moved with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't reach for a gun, he reached for her. Talia felt a massive, tattooed hand grab her waist, swinging her behind the solid wall of his chest just as the blade sliced through the air where she had been standing. Jinwook's other hand caught the soldier's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing in the small office. A guttural roar escaped Jinwook, a sound that wasn't about business or territory, but about the raw, primal instinct to protect what was his. He slammed the soldier into the glass wall, the pain spiderwebbing behind them. "Touch her again," Jinwook whispered into the man's ear, his face inches from the rival's terror, "and I will turn Inchin into a funeral pyre." Talia stood trembling, her camera still clutched in her hands. She had seen him as a mourner and a monster, but as he stood there, shielding her body with his own, she realized the stakes had changed. She wasn't just a substitute anymore. She was a target, and Jinwook was no longer just a boss. He was a man who had finally found something he was willing to go to war for. The adrenaline from the shipyard hadn't faded by the time they reached the penthouse. It had only curdled into a thick, uneasy curiosity. Jinwook had disappeared into his study the moment they arrived, his face a mask of cold fury that Talia knew wasn't directed at her, but at the world that dared to touch her. Left alone in the vast, silent expanse of the apartment, Talia found herself wandering. The penthouse felt different now, less like a palace and more like a museum of things left unsaid. She moved down a long, dimly lit hallway she hadn't explored before, her footsteps silenced by the heavy carpet. At the very end stood a door of dark, polished mahogany, unlike the modern glass and steel of the rest of the home. It didn't have a digital keypad, only a heavy silver handle that looked decades old. Talia hesitated, her hand hovering over the metal. She knew she shouldn't, but the miracle he claimed she was felt like a lie she needed to unmask. The door groaned softly as she pushed it open. The air inside was stagnant, trapped in a different era. It was a room draped in deep red velvet, heavy curtains that blocked out the Seoul skyline, a plush chaise lounge, and walls lined with mahogany shelves. But it wasn't the furniture that stopped Talia's heart. It was the photographs. Hundreds of them. Every inch of the wall was a shrine to Hana. Talia felt a dizzying sense of vertigo as she walked deeper into the room. She saw Hana laughing in a garden, Hana reading by a window, Hana in the same style of red dress Talia had worn to the gala. The resemblance was more than haunting, it was identical. The same crown of curls, the same tilt of the chin, the same cautious dignity in the eyes. On a central pedestal sat a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a single, blood-red ruby. Beside it was a journal, its pages yellowed. Talia reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the frame of a photo of Hana looking out at a rainy window. She loved the rain, a voice rasped from the doorway. Talia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Jinwook stood there, framed by the shadows of the hallway. He didn't look angry, he looked hollowed out, as if the room were draining the life from him. "Is this what I am to you?" Talia whispered, gesturing to the sea of identical faces. "A way to populate this room again, to bring a ghost back to life." Jinwook walked in, his presence making the small, velvet room feel suffocatingly tight. He stopped in front of a portrait of Hana, his eyes filled with a grief so sharp it felt like a blade. "I built this room so I wouldn't forget, but the more I sat here, the more she faded, until the night I saw you." "I am not her," Talia said, her voice cracking with the weight of the realization. She felt like a trespasser in her own life. "You aren't protecting me, Jinwook. You're protecting a memory you've wrapped in my skin." Jinwook turned to her, and for the first time he didn't reach for her. He looked at the ruby necklace, then back at Talia. "The world is coming for you because they think you are my heart," he said, his voice dropping to a low, pained whisper. "But they don't know that you've already started to replace it." Talia looked at the red velvet secrets surrounding them and realized that the contract hadn't just bought her presence. It had made her a prisoner of a dead woman's shadow. If she wanted to survive, she would have to burn this room down, or find a way to make Jinwook see the woman standing in the light, not the one hidden in the dark. The heavy, stagnant air of the red velvet room felt like it was lungs deep in Talia's chest. She looked at the gallery of Hana's faces. each one a mirror of her own, yet each one a lie she was being forced to live. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled thunder of the soul storm outside. Jinwook stood perfectly still, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the hem of her dress, a dark tether she was no longer willing to accept. "Get out," Talia said. Her voice was low, but it carried a sharp, crystalline edge that cut through the funereal atmosphere of the shrine. Jinwook's eyes narrowed, the grief in them momentarily eclipsed by the cold authority of a man unaccustomed to being commanded. "Talia, you don't understand the danger." "I understand that I am a ghost to you," she shouted, the sound erupting from her like a long-suppressed fire. She stepped toward him, invading the space he usually used to intimidate others. "I understand that every time you look at me, you're searching for her. You aren't protecting me from your enemies, Jinwook. You're protecting your delusion from the truth." She reached up and grabbed the small, gold-framed photo of Hana from the pedestal, thrusting it toward his chest. "Look at her. She's dead. She is a memory and she is gone, and I am standing right here. My name is Talia Nairi Lawson. I have a voice that is louder than hers. I have a heart that beats for a future, not a past, and I will not spend another second being a hollow shell for your mourning." Jinwook's jaw tightened so hard the muscle leaped beneath his skin. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the photo, but he couldn't bring himself to take it. The miracle he had claimed to find was now a flame that was burning his hands. "The contract," he began, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Burn the contract," Talia snapped. She began to strip the blazer from her shoulders, tossing it onto the velvet chaise lounge. "If this is the price of my rent, I'll sleep on the street. If this is the cost of my studio, I'll burn the cameras. I would rather be broke and invisible than be a queen in a graveyard." She walked past him, heading for the door, her afro brushing against his shoulder. She didn't look back. "Either you see me, the woman who stood up to you in that warehouse, the woman who cleaned your wounds, the woman who is alive right now, or you let me go. I won't be your living doll, Jinwook, not for all the money and soul." She reached the mahogany door and gripped the handle, her knuckles white. She waited for him to stop her, for the cold grip of the Mafia boss to pull her back into the shadows. Instead, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing. "Talia," he called out. It wasn't a command. It was a broken, desperate sound. She paused, but she didn't turn around. "If you call me by her name again," she whispered, "I am gone forever. Make your choice, Jinwook. Do you want a memory or do you want a partner?" The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She stepped out into the hallway, leaving the red velvet secrets behind, finally demanding the light of the sun, even if it meant facing the storm alone. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege. The tension that had simmered between Talia and Jinwook in the red velvet room was violently interrupted by the shattering of glass. A high-velocity round punched through the reinforced window, narrowly missing Talia's crown of curls and burying itself in the mahogany door behind her. "Down!" Jinwook roared. The grief that had paralyzed him moments ago was gone, replaced by the instinct of a man who had spent his life dodging death. He lunged across the floor, his massive frame colliding with Talia as he tackled her behind the heavy obsidian desk. The air was suddenly filled with the rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire and the scent of ozone and gunpowder. Outside, the night sky over Seoul was alive with the red and blue flicker of police sirens, but they were miles below the war erupting in the clouds. "It's the Guangho," Jinwook hissed, his hand reaching for the concealed holster at the small of his back. He didn't look at the shattered window, he looked at Talia. Her face was pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she hadn't screamed. She had grabbed her camera bag even as she hit the floor. "They're not here for the territory anymore. They're here to take what they think is my weakness." "I'm not your weakness," Talia whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "I know," Jinwook replied, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "You're the only thing that makes me want to win." He tapped a sequence into the underside of the desk, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a bank of monitors showing the elevator lobby. Dozens of armed men were breaching the floor. Jinwook keyed his radio. Inbound at the north elevator. Burn everything. No survivors. The sounds of the penthouse being systematically dismantled, the porcelain vases shattering, the white lilies being shredded by lead, felt like the death of the old Jinwook. He stood up, using the desk as cover, and began to return fire with a clinical, terrifying precision. Each shot he took was a declaration of war, a blood-soaked promise that he would tear the city apart before he let them touch a single hair on her head. The battle spilled into the hallway. The red roses that had been intended for a ghost were now scattered across the marble, crushed under the boots of killers and stained a deeper, darker crimson. Jinwook moved like a shadow through the smoke, his tattooed hand gripping his weapon with a steady, lethal focus. He wasn't fighting for a memory anymore. He wasn't fighting for Hana. He was fighting for the woman in the red dress who had dared to tell him he was a monster. Talia watched from the shadows of the desk, her camera lens peeking over the edge. She captured the flash of muzzle flares, the grit of the debris, and the raw, unmasked face of a man going to war for her. It was a horrific, beautiful violence. As the last of the Guangzhou hitmen fell in the hallway, Jinwook turned back to her. He was covered in dust and flecks of blood, his white shirt ruined. But as he reached out his hand to pull her up, he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally found a reason to live in the present. The roses were dead, the penthouse was a wreck, but for the first time in 3 years, the air felt clear. The smoke from the firefight still hung in the air, but Jinwook didn't move toward the windows to survey the wreckage of his empire. Instead, he walked toward the mahogany door at the end of the hall, the entrance to the red velvet room. His steps were heavy, but they no longer carried the hesitation of a man entering a tomb. Talia followed him, her camera slung over her shoulder, watching as he pushed the door open. The room remained untouched by the bullets, a silent time capsule of a dead man's obsession. Jinwook stood in the center of the crimson chamber, surrounded by the hundreds of faces of the woman who wasn't Talia. He looked at the portrait of Hana, and for the first time his eyes didn't fill with the longing that had defined him for 3 years. He saw the stillness of the paper and the coldness of the frame, and he realized that by holding onto her ghost, he had been strangling his own life. He reached into the pocket of his ruined shirt and pulled out a silver lighter. "What are you doing?" Talia whispered, her voice a mix of awe and trepidation. "I spent 3 years trying to keep the rain from touching her," Jinwook said, his voice dropping to a low, decisive rasp. "But the rain is part of the world, and you are the world, Talia." He flicked the lighter. The flame was a small, defiant spark in the dim room. Without a word, he held it to the corner of the largest portrait of Hana. The paper curled, then caught, a hungry orange glow devouring the image of the woman in the red dress. He moved through the room with a methodical, purgative focus, setting fire to the velvet curtains, the yellowed journals, and the shrines of the past. As the heat rose, the red velvet secrets began to blacken and ash. The scent of lilies was replaced by the sharp, cleansing smell of fire. Jinwook turned to Talia, the flickering light of the inferno casting his tattoos into sharp relief. He reached out and picked up the gold-plated pen from the floor where it had fallen during the attack. He snapped it in half and tossed it into the growing flames. "The contract is gone," he said. The roar of the fire provided a chaotic backdrop to the newfound clarity in his gaze. "The debt is paid. You are not a replacement, and you are not a miracle meant to save me. You are just you." Talia looked at the flames, then back at the man who had just burned his only sanctuary to stand beside her. The grief that had been his armor was gone, leaving him raw and real. She reached out, her hand finding his, her fingers interlacing with his bruised, bandaged ones. "I told you I was going to be your loudest mistake," she murmured, a faint, defiant smile touching her lips. "It wasn't a mistake," Jinwook replied, pulling her closer until the heat of the fire and the heat of his body were indistinguishable. "It was the only thing I've ever gotten right." They stood together in the doorway as the room of ghosts became a room of ash. Behind them, the penthouse was a wreck of broken glass and spent casings, but as the fire reflected in Talia's eyes, Jinwook knew he was no longer looking at a ghost. He was looking at his future, and for the first time in 3 years, He wasn't afraid to let the past burn. The embers of the red velvet room were still pulsing with a dying orange heat when the heavy silence of the penthouse was broken by the sound of approaching sirens and the distant, frantic shouting of Jinwook's remaining security detail. The air was thick with the scent of charred history and ozone. Jinwook stood amidst the ash, his shoulders tense, his hand already reaching for a fresh magazine for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He turned to Talia, his eyes dark with a protective, familiar fury. "My men are clearing a path to the service tunnel," he said, his voice regaining that low, commanding vibration. "You'll take the armored SUV. They'll take you to a safe house in Jeju. I'll stay and finish this." He moved to grab her arm, to steer her toward the exit as he had done so many times before, treating her like a precious object to be moved across a chessboard. But Talia didn't move. She planted her feet on the soot-stained marble and stepped out of his reach. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it carried a weight that stopped Jinwook in his tracks. "Talia, this isn't a debate. The Guangho will send a second wave. I won't lose you." "You won't lose me because I'm not running," Talia countered, her voice growing stronger. She stepped into the center of the room, her crown of curls backlit by the smoldering ruins of the shrine. She looked at the blood on his shirt and the chaos of the penthouse, then she reached out and took the weapon from his unresisting hand. She didn't point it. She simply held it, proving she was no longer afraid of the tools of his trade. "You spent tonight burning your past to prove I'm not a replacement," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unyielding clarity. "Now stop treating me like a victim. You want the city to see that Park Jinwook has found something worth protecting. Then let them see that I am the one standing beside you, not behind you." She walked toward the primary monitors on the obsidian desk, her fingers flying across the keys with the same precision she used to adjust her camera settings. She pulled up the external feeds, identifying the heat signatures of the Guangho reinforcements gathering in the courtyard. "They think I'm your weakness, Jinwook. They think I'm the prey that lured the tiger out of his cage." She looked back at him, her expression a mask of cold, beautiful defiance. "Call your men. Tell them the orders have changed. We aren't retreating. We're going to end this tonight on our terms." Jinwook stared at her, the shock in his gaze slowly melting into a dark, visceral respect. He saw the woman who had walked into the silent room of the gala and accidentally changed his fate, but he also saw the partner he had unknowingly forged in the fire. He had given 1,000 commands in his life, but as he reached out and took his weapon back, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture of submission to her strength. "What is the order, Talia?" he whispered, his voice a gravelly mix of awe and obsession. Talia straightened her blazer, her gaze fixed on the monitors where the enemy waited. "The command is simple," she said, her voice echoing through the ruined penthouse with the authority of a queen who had finally claimed her throne. "Show them that the miracle doesn't just survive, it fights." The storm over Seoul didn't break, but the air inside the penthouse had finally cleared. The smell of smoke and spent brass lingered, a stark reminder of the night the Guangho clan tried to reclaim a ghost and found a queen instead. Talia stood by the shattered remains of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her camera raised. She wasn't hiding now. She was documenting the aftermath, the shattered lilies, the cooling embers of the red velvet room, and the man standing at the center of it all. Jinwook approached her, his silhouette no longer a jagged edge of grief, but something grounded and solid. He stopped just outside the frame of her lens, waiting for her to finish. When she lowered the camera, she didn't see the vulnerable monster from the gala. She saw a partner. He looked at the wreckage of his home, then back at her, his dark eyes reflecting a peace he hadn't known in 3 years. "The city will be talking by morning," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration. "They'll say I've burned my heritage for a woman they don't understand." "Let them talk," Talia replied, stepping into his space. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of the dragon tattoo on his neck, no longer recoiling from the violence it represented. "They don't need to understand. They just need to know that the rules have changed." Jinwook took her hand, his bandaged knuckles resting against her palm. The devil's contract was a pile of ash in the other room, and the debt that had brought her here was dead. There were no more whispers of Hana, no more searches for a phantom stillness. He didn't see a miracle or a doppelganger. He saw Talia, the woman who had commanded his men, saved his life, and forced him to face the light. "I promised you a studio," he murmured, his thumb stroking her wrist, "and a career that would make you invisible no longer." "I'll take the studio," Talia smiled, a spark of her old defiance flickering in her eyes. "But I think I'm finished being invisible. Soul needs a new perspective, and I'm the only one with the lens to capture it." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers as the first light of a new day began to bleed through the rain-streaked clouds. The silent room of his life was gone, replaced by the loud, vibrant reality of the woman in his arms. They were no longer a boss and his captive, or a mourner and his ghost. They were a new legacy, built on the ruins of a dark past and the truth of a dangerous present. As the sun finally broke over the Gangnam skyline, illuminating the crown of Talia's afro and the steady, possessive strength in Jinwook's gaze, the city below felt smaller, less intimidating. The hunt was over, and the era of obsession had evolved into something far more powerful, an alliance. Together, they turned away from the wreckage and looked out at the horizon. Valentine's Eve had started with a command for a ghost, but it had ended with a choice for the living. And as they stepped toward the future, the world learned a final, chilling truth. Park Jin-wook was no longer mourning, and Talia Nari Lawson was no longer prey. They were the new masters of the dark. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Park Jin-wook and Talia Nari Lawson. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.